Dr. Adam Urato, thank you for joining us on the Work of Being Human. It's really an honor to have you. I've been looking forward to this conversation. This audience is in for a real treat. You have such important information and perspective to give on pregnancy, on the use of SSRIs in pregnancy. So can you tell us what you do, how you got to this point in your career, and we're just going to dive into the deep end from there.
Well, it's a pleasure to join you. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on and talk about this. How did I get here? I became a physician. I've been a physician now since 1997. That's when I graduated from medical school. And my interest going through medical school, I really developed an interest in pregnancy and childbirth. The whole issue of it is a miracle. You're watching this, getting a chance to watch this and participating in it every day, and taking care of the moms and seeing the babies develop. I mean, I've been doing it, as I said, for about 30 years, and the fact that it's a miracle hasn't been lost on me in all that time. It's become more fascinating to me over time. And so I enjoyed that. I enjoyed doing that, and I went into it for those reasons. I also really enjoyed the action, which I talk about with people on labor and delivery. I still deliver babies, and I still get an adrenaline rush and a thrill out of it. There can be a lot of excitement on the labor floor, and there's certainly a lot of immediate gratification in terms of reward. With a good labor and delivery, a good birth. And so for all of those reasons, I chose the specialty, and I've been very happy doing it. I think that part of my interest in the issue about medication exposures is from counseling women about this every day, seeing women in my office. Mostly my job is doing ultrasound and counseling in the office, and then the other aspect to it is labor and delivery, doing the deliveries. But having to counsel women on this topic over the years really has required me to think about it a lot, and think about it in the context of the mom, how she's doing, what's going on with her during the pregnancy, as well as with the fetus and fetal development. And so I've taken an interest in that. Over the years, what I've noticed in my office and in society more broadly is an increasing medicalization of things, and an increasing use of pharmaceuticals. And we see that throughout society. In particular, we see that during pregnancy. For years, pregnancy was considered sort of a zone to be very cautious in regarding exposures, all sorts of exposures, but also medication exposures. But over time, that sort of what I would call precautionary principle, where we assume that things could be harmful, even if we don't have all the evidence in yet, we assume that they can be harmful. That precautionary principle has kind of been lost over time. And I've seen an increasing amount of use of medications during pregnancy. And so because of this, I've gotten more active in speaking out about it, and trying to raise attention to some of these issues. And there have been a variety of them that I've been involved with over the years, sort of my activist work, in addition to my clinical medicine work.
Well, and I think most recently, did I read that in January of this year, you were appointed to, was it work at the CDC or something with the Department of Health and Human Services?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That was the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the ACIP committee,
Right.
which has now become quite controversial because
Yes.
our committee basically has been dissolved on the basis of a court ruling, and so there's a lot of discussion now with how it's going to be reconstituted, and what's coming next.
Tell me a little bit, you just used an interesting phrase. You said the increasing medicalization of pregnancy. Tell me a little bit about what you've seen over your decades-long career. What did you see when you started, and where are we now? What are the changes that you're seeing in how women are treated, in how pregnancy is treated? Tell us a little bit more about that, because I'm seeing the same thing in my field. Of course, I'm a therapist, and I'm seeing the increased pathologizing of everything. I mean, just being a human now is a mental disease. So you can't get away from it. So tell us a little bit more about what that's looked like on your end.
Well, I think that we see it in a number of areas in terms of interventions. I mean, pregnancy and childbirth is a normal process. It's not a pathology in and of itself, but we've really highly medicalized it in a lot of ways, and it just in terms of the number of interventions that we do. And many of them are good. I, for example, do ultrasound all day, every day, and there's an upside to it, but there's also a downside to ultrasound as well with some of these interventions. In particular, with medication and medication use, I think that we've become somewhat cavalier, just in general, pregnancy in particular, with the use of these medications and what the possible impact might be. Medicalization, I was referring to in terms of this particularly regards mental health, how people are doing with their mental health. I think an argument can be made that we've moved towards a model of, instead of seeing some things as human stressors and things like that, we've moved to a model to pathologize them or medicalize them and put them into a different medical category, which then requires or has the opportunity for chemical solutions to it or medication solutions, as opposed to other approaches. This happens also in other areas, though, as well, with things like pain in pregnancy or whatnot. This is not an argument. Also, I should step back and say this just to start, is that none of what I'm about to say is in any way to diminish depression or anxiety or mental health issues for women. Like, that's not the purpose of my message. That's not where I'm coming from. And I've been accused of that various times over the years, the pill shaming or fear mongering or things like that, guilt tripping pregnant women. Like, that's not my purpose whatsoever. Depression can be awful, anxiety can be awful, mental health challenges can be awful. So none of this is to try to diminish patients who are experiencing that. This is more about just getting the right information out to pregnant women and the public. And so on issues like mental health issues, or even issues like pain, for example, there's always a question of like weighing the condition or the symptoms versus weighing the risks and the benefits of taking a medication. And it seems like we've kind of lapsed or moved more towards erring on the side of medication use rather than caution in a lot of these areas.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. From the mental health field, we've moved more toward medication use for sure. And as a therapist, I don't prescribe medications, but I work with clients who receive prescriptions for medications. And what that has done is it's taken very normal processes of being a human being, which is, again, the title of my podcast, which is to develop resilience, to grow, to be able to sustain hardship. And again, I am also not minimizing the terribleness of anxiety and depression, but we don't develop resilience when the answer is a pill. And a pill doesn't cure anything from a mental health perspective. It doesn't resolve the root issue whatsoever. It blunts the symptoms. And so what I have found, and I'm curious what your experience with this has been. You've already given us some insight into this because you're saying that you've been falsely accused. And I'm like, you would be. If this is what you bring to your field, you're going to be falsely accused. I hope you have a good therapist. Looking great on you. I mean, I've sort of been standing against the tide in my own field for quite a bit on some issues. They haven't been so much around medicalization and over prescribing, although I think that is happening. It's been some other issues. But what has been the pushback primarily? Because really, and this is what I want to zero in on, is the importance of informed consent. It's
Absolutely.
not right. It's not about telling people what to do. It's about giving people information so that they can make an informed decision about what they want to do regarding their own mental health throughout their pregnancy and otherwise. So what are you running up against? What's the pushback? What are people saying? Is any of it sort of medically legitimate? What's going on your end?
Yeah. So there's just what you said is exactly right. Is that a lot of these are normal processes that have been medicalized. I'm not a mental health professional either. My specialty is obstetrics and gynecology with a particular focus on maternal-fetal medicine. So I keep that in mind, but I do listen to the mental health specialists who talk about this. Joanna Moncrief has talked a lot about medicalization and over-medicalization and what that does, and viewing, as you said, what can be normal processes, normal human setbacks and normal human reactions that have been medicalized. And there's many reasons for that. One of them certainly is, though, is that it's more profitable to medicalize them and then to
Sure.
have this pill that can be manufactured and made by the pharmaceutical industry. And so there's certainly
Right.
a big push in that way. From my own standpoint, what I see that patients aren't getting, and what you said actually about informed consent is, or informed choices is exactly right. That's what this is all about. I
Yes.
don't tell my patients what to do. I'm not telling young women of childbearing age what to do. It's not about that. It's about just making sure they have the right information so then they can make the best choices for themselves. And I always say, I think someone else came up with this quote before I did, but it's that you can't give informed consent or you can't make informed choices if you're not actually informed. So that's
Sounds so simple.
yeah, it's really important to actually get the
Yes.
information. And that's the big thing that motivates me, which is that I think that right now, young women of childbearing age, pregnant women, the public aren't getting the right information about medication use and pregnancy, in particular, mental health medications, and in particular the SSRIs. Those are the most common ones that I see. That's Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, Paxil, etc. And women aren't getting the right information about these. They're not hearing what the science is actually showing. So they're hearing a lot of times, and I see this in my office, patients will come in and I'll ask them, have you been counseled about this? And they'll say something to the effect of, well, they told me they don't affect the baby and they're safe in pregnancy. And that's like not adequate counseling.
Right. No, it's not. My clients are telling me, they're not addictive and you can get off them anytime you want.
Yeah.
And I'm also sort of standing in that lane and saying this is not at all true. The longer you're on them, the harder they are to get off. And for reference, folks who are listening, Joanna Moncrief is out of the University College London, I believe. She's done a lot of really important work in our field, but she created a tidal wave. I believe it was 2022. She released a study that was a meta-analysis. I think it was 2022, a meta-analysis of what did she specifically look at? Was it the meta-analysis of Prozac? Was it sertraline? I can't remember. But basically, she
Looking at
debunked.
serotonin. She was looking to see whether that
Yes,
serotonin hypothesis, are there
yes,
changes
the
or
chemical
alterations?
imbalance
Yes,
theory,
that's
right?
right.
And she debunked it once and for all. It had been debunked actually in Harvard in the 80s. I don't know if you've seen
Yes.
that study, but it's been debunked many, many, many times. But for some reason, when she sort of hit publish in 2022, that study sort of was a shot that fired around the world. And interestingly enough, a lot of mental health professionals pushed back against it. And I thought, folks, why aren't we celebrating this? Why aren't we moving like closer to humanity and saying, okay, if it's not a chemical imbalance in the brain, let's try and understand this a lot more. So, but that opens up a whole can of worms and maybe we'll go down that path. Let's talk a little bit about, Adam, you have, because you're talking about, people are not receiving adequate counseling around these drugs and what their real effects are in pregnancy. And in my lane over here in the therapy office, people are not receiving adequate counseling about these drugs and what their effects are in life and sexuality. And really, your ability to heal the root cause issue is different when you're blunting the emotions that are serving as the symptoms that lead us to the pain to understand what actually happened. Just yesterday, I got a text from a very close friend who I love, and a doctor counseled, he has a teenage child who's, just going through some mental health stuff, and their family pediatrician said, well, it's probably time to put this kid on Lexapro. Yeah. And he reached out to me and said, I trust you. What do you think? And I said, look, I'm going to tell you the truth because I love you and I love your family. Do not do this. And here are all the reasons why. And I will be available to you as a resource if I can. But people are not getting adequate counseling. The challenge that I think a lot of people have, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Laura Delano, who has a recent best-selling book on this, Laura recently testified before Congress, and what she said again and again in her testimony was, nobody told me. And what that was referring to again and again is that she didn't provide, she wasn't given adequate counseling. She wasn't given the right information. And it was starting when she was, I believe, age 13, a similar scenario to what you just described. And what she had been told, or what she was or was not told, she wasn't really told the accurate information. And so that really is a crucial element to this.
Well, we're sort of seeing this across categories. We're seeing this in mental health. We're seeing this in pregnancy. The challenge that I think parents have, and you take a young mom this is her first child. So there's all of that excitement and also anxiety and fear and hope and all of the emotions that come with it. And if she's been on an SSRI, there's a flood of information coming at her. It's fine, won't hurt your baby. And then you're over here saying, actually, it could really affect fetal development. How are you counseling clients on who to listen to? Because there's so much information.
Yeah. You're getting to the crux of the issue here, which is super important, which is when you have these opposing voices, this comes up again and again with medication exposure. I always say medications are chemicals, and chemicals have consequences. That's become sort of a line of mine. Medications are chemicals, and chemicals have consequences. What I mean by that is these aren't naturally occurring substances. I always say, like, they're not oranges that grow on trees. They're not naturally growing like that. They're synthesized chemicals that are being made in a chemical manufacturing facility. So they're going to have chemical effects. The question is just what those effects are going to be. The reason they work or do anything in the body is because they're having chemical effects. And that's what chemicals do. They have chemical effects. So those can go both ways, though. There can be beneficial effects, but there can also be harms with those.
Absolutely. And one of the things I mentioned to my friend is I said, you have to understand, this is going to change your child's brain chemistry.
Yes.
Like, that will happen. That's what it's meant to do. That's what the drug is intended to do. So, and of course, we're still in dialogue about that, and he'll have to make that decision. They'll make that decision as a family. But go on. Chemicals, drugs are chemicals, medications are chemicals, and chemicals have consequences.
Right. So serotonin plays a crucial role in fetal development, in the pregnancy. It's playing a crucial role. These chemicals, what we call the SSRI, people call them antidepressants, you call them SSRI chemicals. These SSRIs, they alter or they disrupt the serotonin system. So if you just think about those two things, just from a theoretical level, if serotonin plays a really super crucial role in fetal development, particularly the development of the brain and the placenta and the pregnancy, if that's the case, and if SSRIs disrupt the serotonin system, then it just stands to reason that they're going to disrupt fetal development. They're going to have an impact on pregnancy. Right. And that's, in fact, what we see. When we do the studies, we see again and again these pregnancy complications. And the pregnancy complications that we're seeing that show up again and again are things like miscarriage, birth defects, preterm birth, low birth weight, preeclampsia, postpartum hemorrhage, and then newborn issues, what people call poor neonatal adaptation, or the newborn withdrawal syndrome. And then the big question is what the effects are down the line. And we are seeing studies that are showing difficulties in things like speech and language and learning, and some mood disorders, mood issues, etc., as these kids grow up. So that's the risks that pregnant women in the public aren't hearing. And I've actually submitted a citizen petition to the FDA to recommend putting a boxed warning, or a black box warning, for those pregnancy issues, and also for the impact on fetal brain development, in order to make the information clear to the public, to prescribers, to pregnant women, to women of childbearing age, that these are what the risks that have been shown for this class of drugs when used in pregnancy. So patients aren't getting the right information about risks. And then the other area where they're not getting the right information about is this question of benefits. We're hearing again and again, the public's being told that what happens is, if this is coming from SSRI advocates or from the pharmaceutical industry, that if pregnant women take these medications, they improve their mood, and by improving that mood, they're able to then go on to have better pregnancy outcomes, like less preterm birth, better newborn weights, etc. That's the argument for the benefit of these, but that's not what the studies are showing at all. When we look at these studies that are looking at continuers versus discontinuers. So the women that discontinue their antidepressants versus the women that decide to stay on them. What we see in these studies again and again is that the continuers have much higher rates of the complications. The continuers on the SSRIs have higher rates of preterm birth, of low birth weight, of other pregnancy complications. And what it looks like is happening is it looks much more like that it's a chemically exposed group, and that's why they're having more complications than the group that stops the chemical exposure. That's what that data looks like. And it looks very similar in a lot of ways to the smoking data, which is that when you look at continuers of smoking in pregnancy versus discontinuers, you see that the continuers are the ones that have much higher rates of complications because they're having a continued chemical exposure. So it looks like it corresponds much more to that. So, but I just want to quickly touch on what you had said. For the public, it's confusing because you've got these voices that are saying that you're not being told the risks, the benefits are being overplayed or oversold to you. But then you've got these other voices, many of whom are key scientific leaders or national associations, for example, the American Psychiatric Association or the American College of OBGYN. So like, who should the public believe? It gets confusing. But what I think the public needs to realize is that it's an unfair battle. It's a mismatch because the groups that are advocating for the chemicals or for the medications have financial support that gets derived from the use of those medications. So that side of the argument, the pro-SSRI side, has this funding mechanism that works. They advocate for the use of the drugs. The drugs sell and generate profits. That profit can then be used to help others to advocate for the drugs or the medications, whether it's the American College of OBGYN, the American Psychiatric Association, the key opinion leaders, and then more sold, which then gives more money to run that cash cycle. So the voices for intervention always have the voices that are against intervention outgunned because the voices for intervention have the intervention, the chemical sales, the cash cycle to support that. Those of us who are saying proceed with caution, beware, you're not being told the risks, who's going to fund that message? Like, no one is funding that message because it's a message that doesn't generate
It's
profit.
not profitable.
It's not a profitable message. That's it. So
no, in fact, it will decrease profit. So not only does the other side have the incentive to fund it in order to make profit, they also have an incentive to silence the other side, so to protect their profitable income stream. So it's really a double whammy.
That is exactly right. So this doesn't mean all the time, depending on what the issue is, that the forces for intervention are always wrong and the forces arguing for caution are always right. It doesn't mean that. You have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. But in general, the public needs to understand that when there is an argument for a product or for a chemical or for an intervention, and that intervention itself leads or generates revenue, is a profitable product, you've got a mismatch, you've got an unfair battle there, and that you may be you need to kind of listen to the voices that are arguing for caution a little more closely, because those are the folks that aren't getting paid for that typically. That often there's an argument to listening more carefully to that side.
Yeah, because a couple of thoughts in that stream. Number one, it's very confusing for people when they're hearing the science, capital T, capital S, the science says this. No, the science says this. And if you're not a scientist and you're not trained to read scientific studies and you can't poke holes in them, it can be very overwhelming for people. However, from a psychological perspective, and this is sort of the building blocks of trust, trust is time plus consistency, but one of the important elements that's built into trust that allows us to trust people is their motive. Yes. Knowing what their motive is. And what you are revealing or exposing for people who haven't thought about this, and I hope that we have, but if we haven't, the same problem exists in my field. The task force that creates the DSM, you know this because we didn't talk about this, but Dr. Urato's pedigree is wonderful. I mean, you went to Harvard Medical School. There's really probably not a better one in this country. It's highly respected. And what that usually implies is that people can trust. But what we know from the DSM is that this is a terribly unscientific field. The field of psychiatry is laughably unscientific. These diseases cannot be like biologically or organically proven to exist. They're clusters of symptoms, but they're called diseases. And if they were truly brain diseases, we'd all be seeing neurologists. So none of it makes sense. I mean, I've sort of had my gripe with psychiatry for a long time, but the authority they have, and that's really what we're getting down to, is who has authority to speak to these issues. And what you're saying is, and I love that you're saying this, because the same thing is true on the DSM task force. And folks, if you're listening and you don't know what the DSM is, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health. It's where all the mental illnesses live. That task force, many people on the task force, every time it comes out, do not have to disclose their links to the pharmaceutical industry, and they don't. Yeah. And there are revealing documents that say, oh, this is the task force, and these are all the pharmaceutical industries that they've been sort of tangled up with. And it's like, oh, well, that makes sense. The more diseases you create, the more drugs you can justify.
Yeah, I don't think the public does completely understand this. And I think that it's one of my other central messages, along with the fact that medications are chemicals and chemicals have consequences, that medications are made in chemical manufacturing facilities, and so they have a chemical impact on the body. Along with that, I try to make the point that what the public needs to understand is that the groups in our society that are supposed to be standing and protecting the public. So on one side, you've got the pharmaceutical industry, and they're trying to sell products to the public. But this group between is supposed to be working on behalf of the public. And that would be like the regulators like FDA or CDC. That would be the academic medical centers like Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Yale. That would be your key opinion leaders, your researchers. It would also be your physicians, and it would also be the media. Those groups are supposed to be working on behalf of the public. But our society has a breakdown of sorts where those groups actually typically are working on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. And so the public needs to understand that, where the groups that are supposed to be giving information and regulation to protect the public have been essentially co-opted by the pharmaceutical industry and put into a sales role. And what they do is, I'm a big fan of 80s music. There was a song in the 80s, Blinded Me with Science, I think was the song.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Blinded Me with Science. I always think of that with these task forces and these academic medical groups where they try to blind you with science and come up with all of these complicated terms, and the public is left. But a lot of what they're saying doesn't make sense in this arena. For example, I tell this story like if a doctor has two patients, one of them is an adult woman, let's say she's 30 years old, not pregnant, has mental health issues, and she's on Prozac. The doctors have been telling her over the years that these are powerful drugs, powerful chemicals that are going into your brain, and they are fixing something in your brain. They're regulating the chemicals, they're normalizing them, and they blind her with science, with all these kind of explanations about all the chemical reactions that these drugs are doing in her brain. Then the doctor goes in the next room where he's talking to a woman, another woman, but she's like 20 weeks pregnant, and she asks, do these drugs affect my fetus, my baby's brain? Are they doing anything? And the doctor says, no, they don't have any effect on the baby. Like, that simply doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. If they're having these chemical effects in the adult brain, then during the pregnancy, as they go across the placenta, and all of these drugs do go across the placenta, they're going across the placenta, they're going into the fetus, they're going into the developing fetal brain, and they're having a chemical impact there. And so, but we're not hearing about any of this, and this is what really motivates me, the absurdity of it as well as the danger of it, because patients really don't get get this. And part of this is because they're being, as I said, blinded by science from these groups like the American Psychiatry Association, from the American College of OBGYN, and many other layers, including the media. The journalists that cover this aren't covering this correctly. There was recently an article that just came out in the Associated Press where they talked somewhat about my petition. And our petition to the FDA is really basic. It's just saying that pregnant women in the public should be made aware with a box warning on these drugs, that they have impact, they are associated with pregnancy complications, and that they impact the developing fetal brain. This is like so basic, so common sense. But instead of covering it that way, the impression that the article leaves the reader with is that it's a radical petition that's designed to take medication away from women. And one of the quotes they use is someone saying, we can't just be telling women to white knuckle their way through this. And like, we're not telling women to do any of that. We're just trying to get proper labeling, a proper information on the drug label, which is sorely needed so that women aren't continuing to come in to see me and others and say, I really was told that they just don't have any effect on me or the baby or pregnancy. Like that, there's clearly a deficiency there that needs to be addressed.
Well, there is. And there's also, from an individualistic perspective, a deficiency in critical thinking. And we've co-opted our thinking out to these agencies, to these institutions, to the media. You know, what you're describing, and you said, you know, a few minutes ago, let's think about this theoretically. And periodically, Adam, you're going to hear my dogs groan because they're in the room with me. So if you hear something that sounds like a low growl, that's the little one.
I'm a dog lover. As long
as
they're not growling.
Sometimes they jump up on camera. I mean, you know, they're part of the family, so they're always in here with me. Otherwise, they go crazy outside the door. You know, what you're describing sometimes, and we go through this in mental health a lot. Like, let's think through it. Mental health should make sense. Okay, mental health should make sense. I can't tell you how many times I have waged a loving therapeutic war with a client, trying to help them understand that childhood trauma affects adult functioning. Just that. Like, how could it not? But in their mind, I don't know why I feel like this. Is this a mental disease? And this is actually my problem with the DSM, which ironically, a study just crossed my desk. I'm a little late to this party, but in 2019, the University of Liverpool published in I think psychiatry research, and the title of the article was psychiatric diagnoses are scientifically meaningless. I was like, yes, like we've got to start moving away from this witch doctory, like this is your diagnosis, this is your disease. And one of the things that they pointed to was because they don't take into account context. They don't take into account the effects of trauma. There's too many overlapping symptoms. Is this ADHD or were you just traumatized? Is this PTSD? There's a lot of overlap. So anyway, all of that to say, I, in my own field, have conversations with people sometimes where I'm trying to make the case for something that seems really obvious. And like I said, I fight very loving, gentle, therapeutic battles. Like, I've got to help you see that you are a normal human being. You are functioning the way you would have functioned in that environment under stress. Like, that's it. It's not a mental disease. It's not a disorder. Your brain did what brains do, and you formed beliefs that are formed in that kind of environment. You survived beautifully. You adapted beautifully. Now let's help you adapt to an environment where you're not under that stress anymore, right? That's a lot of what therapy at its core is. But you can't work with a person that way if they've been, and this is the word I'm going to use carefully, indoctrinated to think that they have a mental disease. I sort of have to win the first argument that, like, let's make it make sense though. You as a human being make sense. And what you're describing is, okay, let's slow everything down. Let's put away all the studies. If serotonin is important for fetal development, for the development of the placenta, this is your terrain, not mine, but I'm just repeating what you've said back. And you're taking a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, right? And it's disrupting your body's, wouldn't that therefore, right? And it's like, what I want people to hear from this, like, you can trust yourself. You can actually listen to information and make it make sense. What you're saying, Adam, makes sense. Of course, it would affect fetal development if fetal development is dependent on serotonin. at least in part.
Yeah.
And this is where I think your collaboration with Joanna Moncrief, I think that you did a podcast a little while ago on Mad in America, favorite place of mine to stop and visit,
Yeah.
with Joanna Moncrief on this very issue, because her whole breakthrough study, or at least breakthrough meta-analysis in 2022 was, this is not due to serotonin. There is no chemical imbalance. So when you're giving women who are in pregnancy, who have maybe been on SSRIs, both streams of information that, first of all, this is going to affect fetal development. Let's just be honest about that. And then secondly, the thing you're medicating is not about serotonin anyway.
Yeah.
Like, I think people kind of feel like the rug is being pulled out from underneath them, but we have to be having these conversations.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that patients also need to understand where that's coming from and why that's coming out. And a lot of this, I try to just get people to understand that, like, these are business people that are trying to sell a product. And the most effective way to sell a medication to the public is to basically say that from a risk standpoint, they don't really have risks, to just downplay the risks as much as possible, and then to oversell the benefits as much as possible. That would be the way a salesman would try to sell a medication. Downplay.
Well, and the other part of that is they uptick the fear.
Absolutely. Very good point.
I mean, there's that.
Very good point. Fear-mongering about the condition, downplaying the risks, overselling the benefits. That's a very good point you make, Vanessa. And so patients need to understand that that's what they're going to hear if they listen to someone who works for the pharmaceutical industry. And patients will think that, okay, that means like the drug reps, people working for the pharmaceutical industry. But what they also need to understand is that the pharmaceutical industry has its tentacles everywhere. It's funding media, it's funding the medical schools, it's funding the expert panels, it's funding the professional medical societies like the American Academy of Pediatrics, like the American College of OBGYN, like the American Psychiatry Association. So in a sense, you can think, the public should think, oh, those people also work for the pharmaceutical industry, like the drug reps. Yes, that's correct. And their message is the same typically, which is downplay the risks, oversell the benefits, and fearmonger about the condition itself, which you were very smart to point out. Patients need to break through and understand that's where that message is coming from.
And that's where I think remembering that motive is part of trust. If you can't identify a motive that's clear and in your best interest, I'm not saying don't trust. I'm saying question before you do trust. If the motive is not clear, if these entities, if these institutions are sort of woven together and entangled in the pharmaceutical industry the way that mine is, a healthy bit of skepticism would go a long way. We shouldn't be as trusting as we are. So let's zoom out.
If I can just jump in there, because I want to say that people have asked me, like, what's your motive in this? And someone on Twitter, I tweet all the time about papers on this. Someone on Twitter accused me of being a grifter, and I don't get paid for any of this. The work I've done on this over the years, and I've worked on several pregnancy-related projects dealing with blood thinners. For a while, the pharmaceutical industry was trying to get all women after having a C-section on blood thinners to prevent blood clots. I led an effort against that. And then later, I led an effort against the drug McKenna, which was a preterm birth drug that we injected into pregnant women for 20 years. And it didn't work. But all of this work that I do is just because I'm very passionate, and it drives me
because you care about your patients.
And it drives me crazy that pregnant women and the public are being sold these things, injected these things, and that's what we're doing to them in order to increase corporate profits. And so that's been my motivation. So I'm not grifting on this. I don't have any grift. I don't have anything to sell or some supplement or anything like this. It's purely from my own, and I would say my own frustration. It's very frustrating to have patients coming into me day after day. It's a daily basis that I see patients in the office. week after week with that story that I was just told by my doctor, these don't affect the pregnancy. It's like, that's not, there's something really wrong there if that's the information that's getting out to pregnant women in the public. So I think you're right about motivation, and I don't want to make myself sound crazy, but the frustration is really
Yes.
what creates this motivation for me to really try to
Yes.
properly inform folks on this.
Well, I share it in my own field, pushing against the DSM, pushing against these completely ridiculous mental diseases that have absolutely no organic origin. I mean, people, as a mental health professional, what concerns me, what keeps me up, is what people believe about themselves. Because what people believe about themselves really forms the basis for their mental health. It's a belief system that you have. It's a relationship you have with yourself. And when people are condescended to by helpful voices and talked down to in such a way by the science, by the media, and they're sort of, it's insinuated that you can't figure this out for yourself, you should listen to us. I don't know if it's because I'm from New Jersey or I'm Italian. I don't know what it is, but there's just a part of me that's like, the hell you will, So, and so I sort of, to my fault, I've erred too far on the other side of being a little bit of a rebel. But in our fields, I think anyone who pushes back, ironically, is seen as like the troublemaker and the rabble rouser. And to your point, I'm like, what is in it for us? You think I'm making millions of dollars doing this podcast? No. I'm not. I'm not Joe Rogan. Like, I'm not. I care about people getting good information, not only about, because this is sort of a niche subject, and I do want to zoom out in a moment, pregnancy and SSRIs, but I also really care that people develop a relationship with their own brain.
Yes.
That is knowing and trusting and intimate, rather than I can't trust the gray matter between my own ears, you tell me.
Yes.
And we've gone too far this way.
Yeah. I'm Italian as well, so maybe that's what this link is. It's
what it is. Now, see, now we're going to start talking with our hands.
I do that anyway. I just can't take it.
Here's Harper. The dogs got excited because I got excited.
I love it. I love it. But to follow up on that point, one of the arguments that Joanna makes frequently, and I think it's a really good point. Again, I don't do too much in terms of mental health because it's a little bit not my lane as far as medicine goes, which is high-risk pregnancy. But I touch on these things. I'm not doing primary counseling of the patients. But I do think that Joanna's point, where when you initially tell patients that they've got a chemical imbalance, or what we were telling patients that they had a chemical imbalance for years, it might provide an initial benefit to them, where they feel better initially, feeling like, oh, this helps to explain many of these challenges that I've had. But as they move forward with that conception, they're actually just weakening themselves by seeing themselves as broken, that their brain is broken, that they're not. She brings this up again and again, and this makes a lot of sense to me, what she's arguing, which is that fundamentally you don't want to be telling people that their brain doesn't work.
Yes. How do you go through life? I mean, I realize this is mental health, and we'll come back to your lane in a second, but how do you go through life with any kind of meaningfulness, purposefulness, like resilience, confidence, if you think that the gray matter between your ears you can't trust? Oh. And it also doesn't take into account human development. I mean, to say to someone who's, and this always blows my mind, and I know you know this just from being a physician, when people go to a physician and they complain of any kind of mental health distress, and the physician will screen for anxiety and depression, and without asking, what happened? What have you been through? Is there trauma? What are you going through? Like, what's going on in your life right now? Oh, these symptoms, this diagnosis, this pill. And it totally divorces the beauty, the miracle, because I see miracles every day too in a completely different way, the miracle of human resilience and the ability of the human mind to heal itself, because it can do that. It divorces that from the human being, from the person sitting in front of you. They no longer see themselves as a human being. They see themselves as like a set of chemical reactions that should somehow be balanced. And if it's balanced, then I can function. that's that's not even how it works. It's literally not how human beings work.
Yeah,
I,
Roger McFillin, who you probably know. Roger asked me. I
I
was
do.
on his
Yeah.
podcast. It might have been his podcast, but it was asking me like, what do you think is going on for your patients? And it differs from patient to patient, but there's a lot of stressors during pregnancy in
Sure.
terms of mental health, in terms of income, jobs,
Yep.
things like that. In particular, relationships. And so it does. I think there's an argument to be made that much of what is going on can be seen as an understandable reaction to human circumstances.
Totally.
And if we're getting away from that, but again, to go back to my whole argument about all of this being a sales pitch, essentially, telling people that it's an understandable reaction to human circumstances is much less profitable of a message
That's right.
than you've got a chemical imbalance that this pill is going to
This pill.
fix.
That's
And
right.
so patients need to, if there's one take home, and again, when I talk about this, I think that it goes beyond pregnancy. It goes to understanding how our medical information systems work and our regulation systems work. If there's one big take home message I would have for patients on this, it's to think about like, what messages am I hearing in terms of safety of the drug, effectiveness of the drug, fear mongering about the condition? What messages am I hearing? And is that a message that's going to drive profit for a large
Right.
corporation?
Yes.
And if it
Just
is,
that question,
right?
just that would
Yeah.
give somebody another layer of critical thinking about what they put in their own body that would be highly productive. Not just around what you put in your body, but every part of life. Stopping the instant trust. I saw it on Instagram. I read it on X, whatever it is. Stopping the instant trust that comes from it happens in a split second. The delivery of the fear mongering, and then the layering on top of a message that says, oh, you don't have to feel fear.
Yeah.
You feel afraid? You don't have to feel fear. We have the answer to your fear. I
Yeah.
mean, your question is the question to ask. Is someone profiting from the answer to this? If
Right.
so, who? And if they are, can I trust it? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Getting people to understand that. That's exactly right. And you started pointing out like it being on an Instagram post or a Twitter post or whatever. Is that the business people on this, the pharmaceutical industry, is one step ahead of all this. They're asking the question like, where are people going to go to get information that's going to help drive them towards consuming our pills? And so they're looking to try to get that information out. I mean, for years, people would go, and they still do, they go to places like the professional medical societies. They go to the experts. So those experts, then the drug companies start paying those experts. They pay the professional medical societies. Now they're paying people online to be putting out information on this. But that is also why what you're doing, Vanessa, and what other people are doing in the podcast world and on Substack and putting out is very helpful, because it's trying to create a different information system that
Right.
isn't bought off by the pharmaceutical industry or other industries that are going to profit to get patients information, untainted information that really is hopefully looking out for them. It also creates a sort of a wild space, because
Yeah.
unregulated, and you don't necessarily know who's giving you the information out there. But at least there's now a space through podcasts like yours and others where people can try to come out. And I do these all the time, try to come on podcasts and just explain to people this messaging about medications being chemicals, about the information systems, and about the impact of these drugs in pregnancy.
Yeah. Let's zoom out a little bit. You mentioned earlier that you were invited on a task force that I guess has since been disbanded. And that was around vaccine information.
That's right.
I think we're up against the same behemoth,
Yes.
and probably with even more pressure, more fear. Tell us a little
Yes.
bit about your work there and what you were trying to affect.
So ACIP's goal is to be providing recommendations to the CDC director to create a body that's going to be looking at vaccines and at the United States vaccine program and try to have open and transparent discussions about that program. You can imagine, though, that how threatening that it would be or is to the pharmaceutical industry. The vaccines are, I don't know what it is now, $100 billion industry. I mean, it's the only thing we have where it's a medical procedure, an injection that children, babies, newborns are getting this right off the bat. Children are getting it just regularly, routinely. It's a humongous industry. And again, it's a pharmaceutical product. And so the pharmaceutical industry wants folks to think about this when they think vaccines, wants folks to think just completely safe, 100% effective, and fear the conditions. And so that would be the sales pitch. That's the way you would most effectively sell vaccines. This is not like controversial what I'm saying. This is common sense. The most effective way to sell something is you tell people it's super safe, basically 100% safe, super effective, 100% effective. And if you don't use it, you've got this horrible
catastrophic things will happen.
Fear on the other side.
Yes.
So what the vaccine makers don't want is open and transparent discussion going on. If you look going back to last June, I think it was last June of 2025 when the new ACIP committee, so ACIP for years existed, I think since the 1960s, but essentially as a rubber stamp. They were rubber stamping any vaccine. I think they were actually recommending or approving for use vaccines on the schedule before the vaccines had actually been approved by the FDA. Now, you'll have to fact check me on that, but I think that's actually true. So they were meeting and saying, well, once it gets approved, we're recommending it to everybody. It hadn't been
we're going to hit the ground running.
It hadn't been approved yet. But they were essentially functioning as a rubber stamp for the pharmaceutical industry in their deliberations and also in their recommendations. And I think with the new administration, when they came in, Secretary Kennedy and the other folks said, look, we want to have robust, open discussion, transparent discussions about vaccines. And they started doing that. If you go and you watch the meetings, I think they had one in June of 2025, and then I think September and December of 2025, they had open and robust discussions. And I think that the big pockets, the pharmaceutical industry, probably were very unhappy with those discussions.
Well, and I think big, robust discussions are characterized as, you're all sitting in a room wearing tinfoil hats. And once that marketing image hits the public, it's so easy to dismiss what's going on in those rooms. I mean, the same thing is happening in mental health. Go on.
No, this is exactly right. I'm just making a note to myself because people also don't understand that the tinfoil hat and the anti-vaxxer and calling people like radicals is part of the sales pitch. It's what you pointed out earlier. It's quieting the dissenting voices. So it's a multi-pronged strategy. When they roll out whatever it is, when Big Pharma rolls out whatever it is, it could be thalidomide, it could be Vioxx, it could be McKenna, it could be SSRIs, it could be vaccines, an individual vaccine. When Big Pharma rolls these out, it's going to follow the same corporate rollout pattern. They're going to fearmonger about the condition, as you said, creating fear. Then they're going to provide you with the solution. It's their product. They're going to tell you that it's basically 100% safe. It's a chemical that we're shooting into you or you're taking, but it doesn't have any downside chemical effects. Like, how could that actually be?
How could it not? Like, how can that be true?
Chemicals have chemical effects, so it's going to have chemical disruptions in the body. And then they'll tell you it's basically 100% effective. Typically, it won't be shown to be 100% effective. I mean, a great example of that was with the COVID vaccine. People have done montages where they have several people doing announcements, 100%, then a couple of weeks later, 99, 98, it's dropping off. Now it's down to 20%. Right. Maybe it's not effective, right? Then now it has people saying that negative efficacy. So you've got to be very careful. It's going to be the same routine every time. They're going to argue that they're safe, they're going to argue they're effective, they're going to fear monger. But then another component of the sales strategy is to make dissenting voices like mine, like yours, like anyone else's, out to be lunatics or crazy.
Right.
Like, I'm just a normal guy. I'm a community physician. I grew up here in my hometown in Massachusetts. I root for the Red Sox. You know, I like dogs.
Oh,
like,
no, I root for the Yankees.
Oh, brother, if I knew that.
It's okay. Let's not go down that road. Let's not go down that road.
Before I came on the podcast. No.
Disclaimer, Yankees fan.
A regular guy, and you look at this stuff, and what I'm saying makes complete common sense, right?
Yeah.
Particularly with what I'm arguing for labeling on these things for the products. But so how are you going to like argue against that from the pharmaceutical industry? You're going to run news stories. And in the news stories, sometimes I get portrayed as like a raving lunatic or a tinfoil hat wearing person. Right. But one thing that they always leave out, and then I'll wrap up with this, but one thing they always leave out is that I've been proven right historically over the years. Like I argued against putting women after a C-section on blood thinners, and then subsequent research showed that would have been a real bad idea because guess what? They had more complication rates like bleeding after being put on blood thinners after surgery.
Again, I am not a doctor. I didn't go to medical school. It just stands to reason if you have a wound and you're put on blood thinners, you might bleed.
They had, you got it. They had more wound complications, bleeding and disruption of the wound. And with McKenna, I was proven right about that. I said, I don't think this drug is effective. I didn't like the initial study, the way it was approved by the FDA. And then over time, when it was studied, people realized, no, it's not effective. And it got pulled off the market in 2023. Yeah. But when they write these news stories on me, and multiple news outlets have covered this now, they never mention that aspect. That, you know, Dr. Urato also said this about McKenna and
they're going to conveniently leave out when you were right, when you were proven right. Well, you know, what you're talking about originally, and this is sort of your specialization, and you talked about it beautifully, is the effect of SSRIs on pregnancy. And, you know, people can go to your page on X. There are so many articles there. I perused them, you know. But if we look at this from sort of a zoomed out lens, what you're talking about is something actually very psychological, which is we have to be aware when we're being sold, and we need to be aware of how we're being sold. And what that makes us is a much more savvy consumer of information and, if necessary, drugs. And that's really, I think, what I'm hearing you come back to again and again is this is a marketing technique that we are all sort of caught up in, and without any awareness of it, it will work on us unconsciously, which is the point. And long before I ever went to graduate school, I lived in New York City, which is why the Yankees, lived in New York City, went to NYU. And one of my first jobs, like my big professional job after I graduated, was I was a sales, for some reason I was a sales manager, but I was in sales, okay? Mm-hmm. And maybe that's because I was eventually going to be a therapist, but sales is all psychology. That's all it is. Yeah. That's all it is. You can sell ice to an Eskimo if you need to. If you're really good at it, you can sell ice to an Eskimo. But the problem with that is that some of us are too easily sold when, and this is the mental health piece, when great amounts of fear are present. And the higher the fear, the more vulnerable we are. The more vulnerable we are, the more we're going to reach and grab hold of any message that comes to us that says, I have the answer to your fear. You don't have to be afraid, because this is an existential risk, is fear. We don't want to be afraid. We don't want to live afraid. And when a woman is pregnant, to circle back to what we were talking about in the beginning, when a woman is pregnant, that's a highly vulnerable state for many reasons. It's physically vulnerable, but it's psychologically vulnerable. It's financially vulnerable. There's a lot of moving parts to that on every layer of being that render a woman highly susceptible to fear, and therefore highly susceptible to somebody coming in with the rescuer mindset. All of a sudden, I'm a victim, I need a rescuer, right? And saying, I have the answer to your fear. And what I love that you're doing today is you're not just talking about pregnancy and SSRIs, you're actually giving people sort of like, I don't know, it's kind of fatherly, like a fatherly lesson, and like, don't be so easily sold. What is their motive?
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think that the fear mongering, one, it can help to promote the use of the drug, but it can also be used as a distraction. So, for example, I try to get my patients, or in
Yeah,
general, pregnant women in the public, and now the FDA, to focus on the issue about the drug. So I'm being concerned about in
right.
particular with my petition, the chemical effects, but talking about the drug itself, what is the actual evidence for safety? What is the actual evidence for benefit? But
Yeah.
the advocates for the drug are using fear mongering to basically distract away from that and then
Yes.
focus on the fear, which gets them into a very good lane for
Yeah.
their product, which is a
Yeah.
lane where they don't have to take on whether it's safe or not or whether it's
Yeah.
effective. They're just in a lane where they can just sow fear to promote use of the drug.
Well, that's exactly right. And the psychological mechanism there is insidious and infuriating. But what it is moving away from the fact and then pointing to the condition. Because if we point to the condition and you're not fixated on the condition like I am, you lack compassion. Right? They go back to this all the time. Like, you want to talk about a drug. I want to talk about the fact that people are hurting. It's like, yes, but this portrayal, and it truly is insidious, and it happens all the time, and it's happened in my own lane, because I have talked about specifically, like, we need to be doing psychotherapy with people who believe that they're transgendered. Like, this whole medicalization of that human phenomena, and again, I'm not taking anything away from the pain or the inner distress of gender dysphoria, but the move immediately toward, okay, gender dysphoria, surgery, hormones, let's put them on drugs. There's a whole middle step called psychotherapy, where we actually look at what's driving this. What do you associate with masculinity and femininity? Who have been your masculine and feminine archetypes in your life? Who were the models of that? How did you relate with those people? How do they reflect on you? I mean, there's so many layers of this that should have been happening. And all of the people who detransition say, no one did therapy with me. And I want to pull out my hair. But then if I'm on this side of the fence, so to speak, in my field, and I say, hey, why are we not looking at the intervention? Let's look at the efficacy of the intervention. People who are receiving these drugs are not necessarily less suicidal than people who aren't. There's no data to support that claim. Oh, you just don't care about these people. I'm like, I care about these people, which is why I'm making the argument. Right?
Absolutely.
So it becomes a psychological play. And that part infuriates me, actually.
No, that's exactly right. And people have been critical about my message or critical about my petition with the argument that I'm not focusing enough on depression and the impact of that. And I tell people, look, depression can be severe. I'm very sympathetic to that. I'm not diminishing anyone suffering from depression. That's an awful thing. Suicide's an awful thing. But when you label a drug, when there's a drug label, the drug needs to correctly label what the risks of the drug are. And we correctly label drugs. And so the risks, for example, of the SSRIs are an impact on fetal brain development. That needs to be on the label. That's outside of a discussion about the impact of depression. And so when I tell people, it sounds almost like what they're saying is that, and people make this argument about untreated depression or untreated depression. But if you look at, for example, cancer, untreated cancer could be fatal for some people. It could cause serious harm. But that doesn't mean that we don't properly label cancer drugs or chemotherapeutic agents. They need to stand on their own. That label needs to be correct. And so you're exactly right. It becomes like a distraction. And it's a way of beating.
It becomes a moral
voices.
attack.
Yes. Beating dissenting voices over the head. You don't care about depressed, pregnant women. Well, with McKenna, they could make the accusation, you don't care about women that have had a prior preterm birth, or you don't care about women who could have a blood clot after their C-section. It's like a ridiculous way of distracting from the medication itself to focus on the issue, to, as you said, to try to bring up sympathy towards that and basically distract the conversation.
That's exactly right, because it's a manipulation technique. If people feel overwhelmed with compassion and quote unquote empathy, then they sort of lose critical thinking. In fact, and I'm not a neurologist, but those centers of the brain are not in the same place. Our prefrontal cortex is what actually helps us think through all of these things. And the places in our brain, you would know more about this than I do, but from what I understand, the places in the brain that register compassion and empathy, they don't run along the same neural circuitry necessarily. So if we move into our limbic system and we're just flooded with pain for another person, which is, of course, we're calling empathy, but I don't know how healthy that kind of empathy is, and compassion. All of a sudden, we've lost critical thinking skills. We are no longer critically thinking through an issue, and it is a manipulative tactic. It's rife with logical fallacies. We could go down that road forever, but it is a manipulative tactic to accuse someone of lacking compassion because they are trying to focus on a specific scientific facet of an issue. Period. That's manipulation. And that's another thing that I think if you're listening to this podcast, you need to be able to spot in the media. Whenever somebody starts playing the violin, like, oh, the poor people, they need more empathy, okay, just put your sensors up. This is probably a manipulation tactic if it's moving us away from a real conversation.
Yeah, it's important, as you said, to really try to drill into what you're being sold and why. Why are they driving at this?
That's right.
And it's in some cases it does make sense to see an aspect of that in a broader discussion, for example, of depression in pregnancy or of antidepressants in pregnancy. It does certainly play a role to have that discussion and to recognize that that aspect of it, to talk about the depression, the impact of that. Absolutely.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that gets ruled out. It can be part of the conversation. But you also still have to have the conversation about the impact of the drug itself, about the risks of the drug, about the evidence of benefits, et cetera. And you can't, as you were saying, shut down the conversation on that. But that's what ends up happening. It's designed to be like a conversation stopper.
It's unvirtuous for you to focus on this. It is cold-hearted for you to focus on this and forget how much pain people are in. It's like no one's forgetting how much pain people are in. We're having this conversation because they're in pain.
Yeah, I think patients don't pay, and the public in general doesn't realize. I think you phrased that really well. That you don't realize that you're caught up in it. That you're part of a sales pitch. It feels like I'm hearing this news. I'm hearing this news about XYZ disease. I'm hearing this, and they're just informing me. But you don't realize this is part of a multi-layered corporate rollout going on.
And they know exactly what they're doing.
Absolutely. It's all, as you said, it's psychological. I did want to comment because you touched on the pregnancy. A lot of people get a little bit confused by what I'm talking about because they look at, is it just a message that I'm giving to pregnant women? Actually, the message, I think, needs to go out to women of childbearing age. And part of it is because the drugs can be so difficult to come off of. And that's it really, I see a lot of women, and I have these discussions, for example, at 20 weeks, when I do their fetal survey. The fetal survey is an ultrasound that we do around 20 weeks into the pregnancy where we look top to bottom at the baby, look at the uterus, the placenta, et cetera. At that point, you're about the halfway mark of the pregnancy. And so that's really not the optimal time to be having this discussion or hearing these things. Really, these decisions need to be made or thought about preconceptionally. And so that's why I always talk about the message really going out to women of childbearing age or to the public prescribers so that people can understand, that this is not an issue specific to pregnancy. This is really, how do we want to be approaching mental health for all of us, but in particular, because it's my lane, for women of childbearing age? Like, are we better as a society approaching mental health through a chemical or medication-based approach that then is going to lead to large numbers of women who are exposed to these and they're developing babies to these medications? So I just wanted to broaden that out so people understand, because people wonder all the time, like, what are those discussions like, having them? And I do have them. I have them every day, basically, in my office, because the SSRI use in pregnancy is fairly common. The rates run anywhere between 5-10% or higher. It really depends on which population you're looking at. But really, it's a more important conversation to be happening beforehand. And this conversation that we're having about sales pitches and corporate rollouts and drug rollouts, it's also an important discussion to have beforehand so that people can recognize recognize it when it's happening. It's like when you're
Yes.
when you keep seeing on the news, I keep hearing them talk about this virus. I didn't realize it was such a problem. And then they talk about it for like 3 months. It's everywhere you turn. And then you hear, oh, a new drug's been approved for that virus or something.
Yeah.
This is how the game is played.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the word is game. Very apt word. How can people find you?
Probably the best way is what you said is on Twitter right now.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
my sons recommend me to go out on the other one, TikTok, Instagram, or whatnot. But right now, I basically am just on Twitter,
Yeah.
and I do mostly just academic tweets. I put out as the new papers come out. I put out the papers, the
Good.
research information, and I mean it's really remarkable though for people who follow me. They say, "Geez, there's like a new paper on this every few weeks showing concerning findings," and that's the way it's been. I mean, I've followed this area of the literature probably for 20 plus years. And every few weeks, every so often, we get new studies showing that the drugs are having these chemical effects and these concerning findings. So I'm
Okay.
at Adam Urato 1. It's at Adam Urato 1 if you want to
Okay.
look me up on Twitter.
Yeah, it's so funny that we keep calling it Twitter.
Yeah,
No one's going to jump on the X bandwagon. It's just still Twitter.
sorry. Yeah.
All right. Adam, thank you for coming on. It has been a real joy to have you on The Work of Being Human.
Terrific. I appreciate your work and thanks a lot for having me as a guest.
Thanks.